What's up, everyone? This is Josh over with the Manchise, and we are going to be breaking down UFC 251, which is Usman versus Jorge Masvidal main event, and this is going to be a banger of a card. Really been anticipating this card for quite a while now. We're going to be getting down to some analysis, breaking down the fights. We'll also be looking at things from a betting perspective and, of course, a DFS perspective. The great news as of Saturday was that Jorge Masvidal is stepping in on 6 days' notice to fight Kamaru Usman. It just makes the fight just that much greater. And that's no disrespect to Gilbert Burns, because Gilbert Burns is a stud. His performance against Tyron Woodley was amazing. Had a ton of Gilbert Burns ownership, by the way. And I honestly think Gilbert Burns would probably put up a better fight than Jorge Masvidal, but Jorge Masvidal is going to sell pay-per-views, man. And you know, he sells the fight. He talks a lot of trash. He's got a big following, so just ramps up this card even more. I can't wait. Fight Island, Abu Dhabi. Let's get into it. And we're going to do what we always do, and that's kind of start at the bottom of the card with the prelims, work our way up. We'll break down each fight. And if you stick around towards the end, I'll give you my optimal DFS lineup at this point. I say at this point because, gotta be honest, things can always change. It's the UFC, right? People drop off, people don't make weight. You have last minute fill-ins, and you always have to take those things into account from a DFS perspective. But as we stand today on July 6th, and I'll make any amendments that I need to make to this video if anything changes, but what my ideal lineup would be from a DFS perspective. So let's get right into it. Enough with all the chit-chatting. And we'll start with the first fight on the prelims here, which is Martin Day versus Davy Grant. And this should be an interesting one. This is in the bantamweight division, which of course is 135 pounds. Martin Day making his second UFC appearance versus the vet Davy Grant. Davy Grant, and this is true with a lot of the European fighters, they don't tend to be the most active. And I know things have been really different with coronavirus, but Davy Grant has fought some legitimate UFC opponents. Martin Day, this is only his second fight in the UFC. He's coming off of a loss. And in that fight, that was just a split decision loss. So wasn't like he went out there and got finished. And people were high on Martin Day. He is rangy for that division, right? So he's 5'10", 70-inch reach. He's going to have an advantage in the reach and height department in this fight against Davy Grant. And Martin Day is the American. Martin Day is the slight favorite. So he's coming in at -185. Davy Grant is +150. Similar records here, right? Martin Day 9-3, Davy Grant 9-4. I guess Vegas looks at this as if this fight stays standing, Martin Day should have an advantage, and I would agree with that. I don't know if this fight will stay standing, though. I think if Davy Grant approaches this fight intelligently, he's going to try to take Martin Day down. I think that's where he has the biggest advantage is in the grappling department. I want to just take a look at some of the analytics for this fight. So I'm going to pull those up. We'll go over some things here. Strikes landed per minute. So Martin Day, 5.6. That's good. That's a solid amount of volume. That's something that you're looking for from a DFS perspective. And Davy Grant, a little bit more average in that area, about 3 strikes, significant strikes landed per minute. So like I said, on the average side, striking accuracy, these guys they're about dead even. 49% for Martin Day, 52% for Davy Grant. Strikes absorbed, though, is where you're going to see a big difference. Davy Grant 1.68 to Martin Day's 3.2. Like I said, his last fight in his UFC debut, split decision loss, and it was a little bit of a back and forth fight. Takedowns is also where you're going to see a difference. As I already mentioned, if I'm Davy Grant, I'm trying to take Martin Day down in this fight, and Davy Grant definitely has an advantage in the grappling side of things. averages 2.6 takedowns per 3 rounds. Only 1 for Martin Day. Again, that's just kind of based on 1 fight. And Martin Day's takedown defense was solid in his first fight at 85%, but he was taken down. Davey Grant's takedown defense, 64%, not great, but I don't think Martin Day is going to, in this fight, attempt too many takedowns. I think Martin Day has an advantage striking. I think that's where he would ideally want the fight to stay. But this is the thing, from a DFS and just a betting perspective in general, I don't know if I agree with the betting odds that Vegas has out there right now. And the big reason for that is just the experience advantage that Davey Grant has, right? So Davey Grant's the underdog, plus 150, slight underdog, nothing crazy. But he has, if you look at his record, he's fought some legitimate bantamweights in the UFC. He's got experience against Chris Holdsworth. Now, that was a long, long time ago. But, you know, and shout out to Chris Holdsworth. We know he retired, has the issues with the concussions, but Chris Holdsworth was a stud. Or it looked like he was going to be a stud before the health problems. Davey Grant's got a win over Marlon Cheeto Vera, which is super impressive, and that was a long time ago. I think that it's like 4 or 5 years ago. But I can't take that away from him. As much as Cheeto has improved, and it's been 4 years. I mean, Cheeto's been on a roll. I know he lost his last fight in what was a super close one. He lost to Song Yadong. I believe that was a split decision. But a lot of people thought Cheeto should have walked away with that one. Nonetheless, it was a great fight. And Davey Grant has also fought Manny Bermudez. Now, he was choked out by Manny Bermudez. It was a submission loss. Might have been by triangle. But he was subbed in that fight. He also lost to Damian Stasiak, who's UFC veteran. He was subbed in that fight as well. But Davey Grant's most recent fight, which was less than a year ago, was against Grigory Popov. And he did win that by split decision. So he has that advantage in experience. And for that, if I was a betting man, which I am, I would probably go with the underdog in this one. From a DFS perspective, probably won't have a ton of exposure. There's 2 reasons for that. One being it's the first fight of the night, and I just hate to start off my night on the wrong foot. Second reason being I don't think there's a ton of potential for a finish in this fight. I think this one probably goes the distance. So when I'm building my lineup for tournaments, I like to get fighters that I am either super confident that they are going to win, or have the potential to finish a fight. And not to take anything away from these guys. It's not that they don't have finishing potential. This is the UFC. Anybody can finish anyone on any given night, but I don't see this fight ending in a finish. And if I look at some of the analytics here, Vegas agrees, though I'm shocked. 24% chance of finish by Martin Day, expected outcome on bestfightodds.com. I don't know if I agree with that, but so if you're gonna diversify your lineup, right? I don't think there's gonna be a ton of exposure in tournaments for this fight on this slate that has some big names. Davey Grant's not a horrible guy to get in your lineup. I play on DraftKings at 7,700. Not terrible if you're looking to diversify your lineup. You can definitely get some stock in Davey Grant, but again, not going to be in my ideal lineup. So we'll move on to the second fight here, which is a female bantamweight fight. Carol Rosa versus Vanessa Melo. So, and this is again not a fight that I'm going to have a ton of exposure in, and for a lot of the same reasons. I don't expect a finish in this fight. Carol Rosa, this is only her second fight in the UFC, I believe. Let me just take a peek at that. Yes, she's got a split decision win about a year ago against Lara Procopio. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. And Vanessa Melo, she has a little bit more UFC experience. This will be her third UFC fight. She's 0-2 in the UFC. But her first fight, she kind of got tough draw there against Irene Aldana, who is proving to be a legit contender in the bantamweight division. She lost by unanimous decision to Irene Aldana about a year ago. And then her most recent fight was against Tracy Cortez, and that was a quick turnaround fight. She lost decision to Tracy Cortez as well. Now, Tracy Cortez, 6-1 professional record, but I have to be honest, I haven't watched a lot of her, so I don't know how great of a fighter she is. But where Carol Rosa is going to have an advantage here is just in size alone. I mean, she's got about a 3-inch reach advantage, 1-inch advantage in height as well. And Rosa has the more polished record, 12-3. So that's always a good sign. Whereas Melo, 10-7. Basically a 500 fighter to this point. That bantamweight division for females, there's just a huge, significant drop-off in talent when you're looking at these unranked female fighters. I want to pull up some of the analytics on this fight. We'll go over, we'll just look at this matchup a little bit deeper. Carol Rosa, 11.4 strikes landed per minute. That is impressive and significant. That can't be just glossed over. That is a significant amount of volume. So from a DFS perspective, that's what you're looking for. Vanessa Melo, much more average in that category at 3.6. The other thing that's interesting to look at here is Carol Rosa also absorbs 11 strikes per minute. But again, these numbers are based on one UFC fight, so not much to talk about there. Takedown average, neither of these women have attempted a takedown yet in the UFC. And Carol Rosa, 100% takedown defense, so she has been able to stuff takedowns so far. Again, you're looking at a small sample size here. I don't think we are going to see a finish in this fight, which is why I'm not going to have a ton of exposure on the DFS side. If I was a betting man, I do think Carol Rosa wins this fight, but at minus 235, not something that I would be willing to really invest in or risk a significant amount of money. From a DFS perspective, Carol Rosa is also the third most expensive fighter on this slate at 9,200. Man, that's interesting. I know she had some crazy output her first fight, but I don't like to pay for really anyone over $9,000 in DFS unless they have legitimate finishing potential or are in a main event slot 5-round fight where you know there's just the potential for them to really rack up a lot of points either by takedown or just significant strikes landed. So I think I'm going to avoid Carol Rosa and Vanessa Melo, third cheapest fighter on this card. I think there's better options in that 7,000 range. So I'm going to avoid her as well. And with that being said, we'll move on to the next fight here, which should be an interesting one. This is Zhalgas Zhumagulov, hopefully I didn't butcher that name, versus Raulian Paiva. This is in the flyweight division, man. So these are small fighters, 125 pounds. And Zhumagulov is making his UFC debut. Haven't watched a ton of Zhumagulov. I have done a little bit of research, watched some highlights, and he's your typical Russian fighter. I mean, this is a guy that's gonna want to grind it out, right? take you down. And if I just look at his record, he's had a ton of decisions. He's 13-3. He's on a 4-fight win streak, but this guy's a decision merchant. Like, let's be honest, not a ton of finishing potential there. Paiva, on the other hand, is a UFC veteran at this point, I suppose. I mean, he's had 3 UFC fights. Also, made it to the UFC on the Contender Series. So he won his fight on the Contender Series. Started off a little bit rough in the UFC. 0-2 with his first 2 fights. Lost a split decision fight to Kai Kara France, who is legit, and won the Ultimate Fighter, I believe. So that was a tough draw for his first UFC fight for his debut. But he fought well in that fight. It was a split decision. So, and I remember watching that fight. At the time, I didn't know too much about Paiva, and I was really impressed. I think the big takeaway there is Paiva's a big 125-pounder. He's 5'8", 70-inch reach, and that's going to play to his advantage in this fight as well. Zhumagulov, 5'5". He has less reach than Paiva as well. So, yeah, he lost to Kai Kara France, and then he was finished. He was TKO'd by Bontarone. Again, another tough draw. Bontarone 15-1. And that kid looks good. So, yeah, really 2 tough draws for Paiva there. And then his most recent fight, which was 4 months ago against Mark De La Rosa, he was able to finish Mark De La Rosa. And I think that's the fight I would focus on, because I think De La Rosa's level of skill probably matches Zhumagulov's. So, and Vegas is in agreement with me there. Paiva's minus 185, Zhumagulov's plus 150. And I definitely agree with the odds there. Paiva's a guy that I'm pretty confident should win this fight. He's a guy that you might want to lay some coin on. From a DFS perspective, it's tough because Paiva's in the high 8,000 salary range. It's a little bit difficult because there's some other guys in that area that I'm just a little bit more confident in. So I won't have a ton of exposure to Paiva, but he might be a guy that I'll slip in a lineup here or there just to kind of diversify things from a tournament perspective. So Paiva may have a little bit of exposure too. On the flip side, Zhumagulov, he's just too much of an unknown for me at this point, and his style of fighting doesn't produce a ton of points from a DFS perspective. So I will probably avoid Zhumagulov from a DFS perspective. We'll dive into the stats in that fight as well, even though we're not going to get great numbers here because Zhumagulov is making his UFC debut, but he does have legitimate professional experience fighting in Russia. So Paiva, 4.81 strikes landed per minute. That's pretty solid. And again, because he has a striking advantage here in this fight, that's something that you don't want to gloss over. You want to take that into account because he should be able to put up some numbers from a DFS perspective. Strikes absorbed 5.07, which would usually be pretty worrisome to me, but because he's not fighting a great striker in his opponent in Zhumagulov, and because he's only had three UFC fights and 2 of them were against legitimate opposition, that number could be a little bit skewed. And then Paiva's not a guy that's going to take you down. In his 3 UFC fights, he only averages less than a half of takedown attempts per 3 rounds. And his takedown defense this far has been decent at about 79%. So if that number was 50%, I'd be a little bit concerned that maybe Zhumagulov could grind out a victory, but 80% is solid. So, and he's a guy that has some jiu-jitsu background. I feel pretty confident that Paiva should be able to avoid the takedowns in this and really just output more damage. So lean Paiva in this one, but again, not someone I'm going to have a ton of exposure from a DFS perspective. So we'll move on to the next fight here, and this should be a pretty good one. I'm excited for this fight. This is Marcin Tybura versus Maxime Grishin, and this is going to be an interesting one because Maxime is taking this fight on short notice. Now, I believe when this card was first announced, Maxime did have an opponent. Tybura was supposed to fight Romanov, who is another European fighter that would have been making his UFC debut and is undefeated. He's a guy that is being viewed as, or touted as, a decent prospect. So I think this is a step down in competition for Tybura, fighting Maxime Grishin. But with that being said, Grishin is still a legit pro, right? He fought in the PFL. I mean, he's got close to 40 fights, professional fights. He's 37-2 in his professional MMA career. And he did have good success in the PFL. Couple wins, including one over Jordan Johnson, which is impressive. Jordan Johnson was pretty solid in the UFC. Not the most exciting or flashy fighter, right? He was a wrestler that wanted to basically control the fight. I think that was one of the reasons why he was let go. But yeah, when I see a guy that has that much experience and wins over UFC level talent of fighters, you just can't take that guy lightly, and Vegas isn't. In fact, I believe this is basically a pick'em. Yeah, minus 115 either way at this point. So Vegas is looking at this to be a pretty close or even fight. I don't know if I agree with that 100%. Really, the big question here is there going to be a huge size advantage for Tybura, because Maxime has fought at light heavyweight. He's tall, he's 6'3", and he's got solid reach at 76 inches, but he's used to fighting at a lower weight. This fight's going to take place at the heavyweight division, and Tybura is a big boy, right? He's 250 pounds, 6'3", 78-inch reach, so he's a guy that's used to fighting bigger competition, and hopefully his chin holds up in this one. Tybura's been kind of back and forth in the UFC. He started out pretty well as a guy that you saw some potential in him. Maybe he would be a guy that could potentially make a run for that belt in the heavyweight division. Heavyweight division's not the most stacked division, but as of recently, he's been more of a 500 fighter. As he's fought higher up in the ranks, he's struggled. He got knocked out by Derek Lewis. He got knocked out by Shamil Abdurakhimov. He got knocked out by Augusto Sakai. All three of those guys are legit heavyweights in the UFC. But he also had a win mixed in, sprinkled in there against Stefan Struve that went the distance. And he also had a win most recently that went the distance against Sergey Spivak, who's he's no slouch either. I mean, I think he's like 9-1 or 10-1. So Tybura's, I would give him the edge in this fight. I just think that size is going to be too much for Maxime to overcome. From an analytics perspective, if I take a look at this fight, and again, we're not going to get great numbers on Maxime Grishin because it's his first UFC fight, but from Tybura's perspective, 3.52 significant strikes landed per minute. That's about average. It's not a great number. He's not a high output fighter, but he does have some power. So I do see some finish potential there. Strikes absorbed, about 3 per minute. So again, it's pretty average. Takedowns, 1.5 per 15 minute, or per 15 minutes. And Tybura, that's something though that number is something I want to pay attention to in this fight, because of the size advantage. If Tybura ends up on top, it could be a ground and pound situation. So at least from a DFS perspective, that's something that I'm looking at. Takedown defense, 82% is great as well. He's a guy that prefers to keep the fight standing, but between a really good takedown defense percentage and Grishin just being undersized in this fight, I'm not concerned that Tybura will be taken down. So if I'm going to have any exposure in this fight from a DFS perspective, it would be on the Tybura side. He's coming in at around 7,900, which I think that's a pretty reasonable price. But I don't expect to have a ton of exposure. I think in that price range, there's a couple other guys that would be maybe better options, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. So I might have a small percentage of ownership in Tybura for this card, but won't be in my main tournament play. So we'll move on to the next fight here, and this is one that I'm really looking forward to. Leonardo Santos versus Roman Bogatov. Roman Bogatov is making his UFC debut, and he is an undefeated fighter with a record of 10-0. Leonardo Santos, 17-3, veteran in the UFC, getting up there in age, 40 years old, but he hasn't lost a fight since 2009, and he has fought some legit competition in the UFC. This is a guy, because he doesn't fight often, and I think because he's a little bit older, doesn't get really enough credit for how good of a fighter he is. But I mean, he has wins over Kevin Lee, Rocco Martin. Let me just take a look here. Who else? Stevie Ray, his last fight, which was a little bit over a year ago. He was able to knock out Stevie Ray. So some impressive victories on Leonardo Santos' resume. And Vegas has him as a pretty moderate favorite, minus 185. And as I mentioned, he will be fighting Roman Bogatov, who is a slight underdog at plus 150. Now, I haven't been able to watch Roman Bogatov in real time. His fighting career has taken place in Russia. I've done some research on this fight, and I've watched a lot of Bogatov highlights. And what I am sensing, or what I get from Bogatov here, is he's a guy that's kind of like your typical Russian fighter. He's going to want to take this to the ground and grind this out, which I don't think fares well for him against Leonardo Santos, a guy who's very well-versed in jiu-jitsu. I think Santos has an advantage just about everywhere in this fight. Certainly has an advantage standing. If you just look at raw numbers here, from a size perspective, 6 foot tall in height versus Bogatov, who's 5'9". He's got a 75-inch reach, which is solid for the lightweight division. The 155-pound division, man, is a stacked division. There are some killers in that division. Again, I want to take a look at some analytics here for this fight. We're not going to get great analytics for Bogatov since it is his first UFC fight. But what I like to see here from Santos is, even though he's not a high output fighter, he's a very good defensive fighter. Strikes absorbed per minute, 2.5. Strikes landed per minute, 2.4, 2.5. So again, not a ton of volume, not a ton of output, but pretty good defensively. And where you're really going to see that is his takedown defense. 86% takedown defense in the 155-pound division, which is something that we really want to pay attention to here, considering the fact that he's going to be fighting someone who's going to want to take him down. Bogatov is not going to want to stay on the outside and strike with Santos. So yeah, breaking down the numbers here. The takedown defense at 86% for Leonardo Santos is definitely something that's impressive here. And the other thing that's impressive is he's no slouch on the ground, right? So if Roman Bogatov takes him to the ground, from a jiu-jitsu perspective, Santos is definitely going to have an advantage. Fights from a good team, Nova Unal, those guys know what they're doing. And I'm just confident that Santos wins this fight. Minus 185, those are decent odds as well. And from a DFS perspective, I think I will have some Santos ownership. Definitely a guy I want to get in there. He's not a huge high output fighter, but he's got just too many tools, man. He's a guy that can finish this standing. He's a guy that can pull a submission, which is something I look for, or something that I look towards when putting together my DFS lineup, especially in tournaments. I don't know if he'll be high owned because, again, he's up there in the high 8,000s, 8,800, right around Usman, Rose Namajunas. So, I mean, he'll definitely get some exposure, but he's someone I plan on having in some of my lineups here. So we'll move on to the next fight. Makwan Amirkhani versus Danny Henry. Two Europeans, a lot of Europeans on this card since, it's Fight Island, and one of the whole reasons why they set that up to get these international fighters that couldn't come to the United States some action because of the coronavirus. So we're looking at a featherweight fight here between Makwan Amirkhani and Danny Henry. Makwan Amirkhani 15-4, Danny Henry 12-3. Makwan Amirkhani is a decent sized favorite in this. He's minus 200 to Danny Henry's plus 160. Both these guys are 31 years old. Again, featherweight division, so 145 pounds. And they're pretty similar in size and stature. Amirkhani's 5'10", Henry's 6 foot. And close in reach as well. Danny Henry's 71 inches, Amirkhani 72 inches. So even though he's about an inch or two shorter, he will have a slight reach advantage. This should be an interesting one because I'm not that impressed with Amirkhani. I know he had that back and forth fight with Jason Knight a couple years ago. Really became like a grappling fest. It was kind of a sloppy fight, but it did have some it did feature some pretty nice scrambles and submission attempts. And I mean, it's one of those fights that if you're a big UFC fan, big MMA guy like me, it's a nice change up. You definitely appreciate it, but the average fan, they want to see two guys slug it out, right? So he had that win against Jason Knight. He also subbed Chris Fishgold. But his most recent fight, he got KO'd by Shane Burgos. So, and I don't know how much we can take away from that because Shane Burgos is just an animal. I mean, that fight against Josh Emmett was crazy. Up until the Poirier fight 2 weeks ago, you could argue that could have potentially been a candidate for fight of the year. So, and Shane Burgos is a stud. So, not taking too much away from Amirkhani in that fight. On the flip side, Danny Henry, his most recent fight in the UFC took place about a year ago, and he was subbed by Dan Ige. And kind of similar situation. Dan Ige is legit. He's the real deal. In fact, he will be the main event for a card coming up here pretty soon. So he was subbed rear naked choke by Dan Ige. But before that, he was able to string together a few wins in a row. So he was able to beat Hakeem Dawodo. He subbed him via guillotine. He beat Daniel Tamer. He won that via decision. And at the time, that looked pretty impressive. We know the Tamer brothers have kind of fallen off, but they're still legit kickboxers. Those guys, they're going to put up a good fight. So unanimous decision win against Daniel Tamer, pretty solid. And that was in his UFC debut. So betting odds in this one are just interesting to me. I mean, I guess you could give the edge to Amir Khani just from a grappling standpoint. But minus 200s, it's just too rich for my blood, right? Not something I'd be willing to lay some serious coin on. On the flip side, Danny Henry plus 160, there's some solid value there. I think this is going to be a close fight, or at least much closer than what Vegas and the Vegas odds are implying. And from a DFS perspective, this is one that I'm certainly going to stay away from. We'll hit on that a little bit here. I just want to break down some advanced analytics. So we're going to open up this fight, and what I suspected, Makwan Amirkhani, just not a ton of output in his fights, man. 1.6 strikes landed per minute, and that's never good when you're putting together a DFS lineup, right? Like, we want a little bit more volume than that. He doesn't absorb a ton of strikes, about 2.75, close to 3. And on the flip side, Danny Henry, 5.85 significant strikes per minute, which is pretty solid, but he absorbs 4.85 strikes per minute on the flip side there. So definitely involved in more scrappy fights is really what it comes down to, at least from a striking perspective, right? Where you see a big difference here is the takedowns, and I assume that's why Vegas is viewing Amir Khani as the favorite that he is. Averages close to 3.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, and 1.5 sub attempts per 15 minutes, which is pretty solid. And as I mentioned, he already has a few submission victories under his belt. But Danny Henry's no slouch when it comes to jiu-jitsu either. He's got a guillotine victory in the UFC. He averages close to 3 sub attempts per 15 minutes. Some of that is a result of him being taken down. Neither of these guys have great takedown defense. Amir Khani, 57%. Danny Henry, 66%. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. This is one of those weird ones, right? When you're watching a UFC fight and you have like 2 wrestlers or 2 jiu-jitsu practitioners, right? It's very rare that you see that turn out to be a wrestling match or a jiu-jitsu match, right? Because they're just so strong in that area that it ends up usually being a striking match. But stylistically, I look at this and it's the opposite, right? Both these guys aren't great at preventing takedowns. So we'll see how that kind of turns out and how that plays out. It could be that Danny Henry recognizes that flaw in Amir Khani and does attempt to take him down. But then again, it might not occur because Danny Henry should have an advantage standing on the feet. So this is probably the weirdest fight on the card for me, which is why I don't expect to have much exposure at all. And even from a DFS perspective, like, the salaries are very interesting to me as well. Makwan Amir Khani, 8,600. And that's going to be a range where you're going to have some exposure to, but doesn't rack up a ton of fantasy points. Averages 75.8 fantasy points on DraftKings. And when you're looking at this fight, you're hoping, if you're going to pay 8,600, that he's going to pull out a sub. I just don't know if I see that. And then on the flip side, Danny Henry, 7,600 is his salary. Very similar average fantasy points, 72.8. I just don't see myself having too much exposure. This isn't a bet that this isn't a fight that I just really want to be involved in at all from a betting side of things. I just think whenever Amir Khani fights, there's just like a level of unpredictability. Like, just go back and watch that Jason Knight fight. It was just crazy. It was one guy on top of the other guy, scrambles, advances. It was just chaotic and hectic, and I don't know, when I watch those types of fights, I don't ever feel safe, and a lot of times they don't really, they end up being a decision. It doesn't lead to a ton of points, so not something that I'm going to get too much exposure to. So we'll move on to the next fight here, and this is Muslim Salikov versus my boy Zaleski dos Santos. I say he's my boy because usually I do root for him, but I'm going to be on the opposite side in this one. So this is a good welterweight scrap here at the 170-pound division. Both these guys are pretty evenly sized and evenly matched. Salikov, 5'11", 70-inch reach. Zaleski dos Santos, 5'11", 73-inch reach. He's got a slight reach advantage. Where you're going to see some differences here is their record. Salikov 16-2, the king of kung fu. Zaleski dos Santos 22-6, and both of them have some serious UFC experience. So we'll just take a look at Zaleski dos Santos. He won his most recent fight versus Alexei Konchenko. It was a unanimous decision victory. He lost a fight to Zhang Li. He actually got knocked out in that fight. I remember watching that fight. Li looked super impressive. And then before that, he subbed Curtis Millender, which that was surprising. Had a KO versus Luigi Vendramin, and he also KO'd Sean Strickland. So, I mean, some impressive victories there. Salikov on the other side here beat Laureano Staropoli by unanimous decision. And I probably butchered his name, by the way. It's the Argentinian fighter who is no slouch either, by the way. I think he was like 9-1 or 9-0 at the time. So that was a good victory, impressive victory by Salikov. He KO'd Nordine Taleb. That's an impressive victory. Taleb has serious Muay Thai skills, just built like a brick in that division. A guy that could never really like compete with the top end fighters, but he's dangerous nonetheless. Before that, KO'd Ricky Rainey, and then he had a loss. He got subbed by Alex Garcia, rear naked choked. That was a tough one for Salikov. So, but impressive. I mean, 4-1 in the UFC. I mean, 3-1 in the UFC so far. And I like Salikov a lot in this fight. I just think Salikov is the more well-rounded fighter because he's no slouch in the striking department. That's where you would think Zaleski dos Santos would have a significant advantage. I'm going to pull up the analytics on this fight, but I think we'll be surprised. I think it's going to be closer than most people would suspect. So we'll pull this up here. Significant strikes landed per minute, 4 for Zaleski dos Santos, 3 for Muslim Salikov. So, it's pretty close. I mean, both fighters are about average in that area. Striking accuracy, again, 39% for Zaleski dos Santos. That's not that great of a number. 46% for Salikov. So maybe not the same amount of output, but he does land at a higher clip. And then this is where you're going to see a big difference. And this is why I said Salikov, in my opinion, isn't at a disadvantage striking. And that's on the defensive side of things. 3.13 strikes absorbed per minute for Zaleski dos Santos. Slightly less than 2 for Salikov. Doesn't seem like a significant difference, but it is I mean, 1 strike less per minute is something that can't be glossed over. And then where Salikov has the advantage is the grappling, right? So he's averaging 1.25 takedowns per 15 minutes, 42% takedown accuracy, close to 75% takedown defense. And when you look at dos Santos, these numbers aren't great. 0.65% takedown attempts on average per 15 minutes, only 20% takedown accuracy, And this is the big outlier here. 48% takedown defense percentage. That doesn't look good when I look at this fight stylistically. I think Salakov's going to have a huge advantage there. So this is one of those where it's interesting because from a DFS perspective, even though both these guys have had finishes, they're pretty well evenly matched. So I wouldn't say, hey, Salakov's going to come out and finish Dos Santos, but I'm pretty confident that he's going to win. In a worst case scenario, I don't want to say worst case scenario, but in a scenario where he wins, he's more likely to grind out the victory than to provide a finish. But I'm confident that that's what's going to happen. I think that there's a very good percent chance that he grinds out the win. And if this goes to decision, I just can't see Dos Santos keeping this from getting to the mat. And that's really how I look at it. So I am going to have some Salakov exposure. At 8,200, I think that's a good price point for a guy that, even though, again, probably not a ton of output, but a guy that should win this fight. And again, the odds are pretty close. It's basically a pick-em. Salakov is a slight favorite. He's a guy that I would be confident putting some money on as well. So, yeah, I like Salakov in this one. Moving on to the next fight here, which should be absolutely awesome fight, is Volkan Oezdemir versus Yuri Prochazka. And Yuri Prochazka is making his UFC debut. If this is a fight that you don't know too much about or you weren't excited for, I'm going to try to pump it up here to the best of my ability, because both of these guys are legit strikers, right? Volkan, no time. Oezdemir, we saw what he did when he was climbing up the light heavyweight ranks in the UFC. Finished Jimmy Manuwa, just devastating KO in like 8 seconds or whatever it was. Then he went on a little bit of a losing streak, right? So he lost to Daniel Cormier, one of the greatest of all time. He lost to Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith subbed him. Again, Anthony Smith, no slouch. Guy that just recently fought for a title. Lost to Dominic Reyes, another guy that has championship fighting experience. And that was a split decision fight. And I remember watching that fight, man. It was razor thin. I mean, it could have went either way. But his two most recent fights, he KO'd Ilir Latifi. There was just such a size disadvantage there for Latifi. He's more short, stocky, stout fighter. Couldn't take down Oezdemir, and Oezdemir KO'd him, so not too surprising. And then split decision win versus Alexander Rakic. This is another guy, European fighter, that not a ton of people know about, but Alexander Rakic is the real deal. He's the truth. He's a good fighter. So, Oezdemir, it's nice to see him on a little bit of a winning streak going into this fight. On the flip side, facing Yuri Prochazka, who is coming from Rizin and was really a star at Rizin, 26-3 record, and he's on a pretty significant win streak. So not going to get into all of the details, but just to give you a heads up, his last fight was against CB Dalloway, who was a UFC veteran. He knocked him out. In fact, his past 5 fights, he's KO'd all of his opponents. I saw an interview somewhere where Yuri was talking about how fighting in Rizin was basically it was like a video game to him. I mean, he's really just been on a streak where he's just dominated every fighter and knocked them all out. He's still an underdog in this fight, plus 140. Volkan Oezdemir's minus 170, which is interesting because they're very similar in size. Volkan's 6'2", Yuri's 6'4", both built pretty strong. About the same age. Yuri's a couple years younger. He's about 3 years younger, so he's 27 years old. Volkan's 30 years old. So, and both these guys just have a lot of fighting experience, which is good. But why I'm so pumped up for this fight is I guess there's really two reasons. One is Yuri going to show that he's the real deal. If he finishes Volkan, I mean, it'll just be another knockout. The streak continues for Yuri Prochazka here. And I would expect the UFC to start to push him as a contender. And as I've already talked about, Volkan can finish anybody at any point. He just has that level of power. So two reasons are Yuri could be an up-and-comer, could be a guy that fights for that light heavyweight belt. And then beyond that, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a finish in this one. In fact, I expect it, which means from a DFS perspective, it's not a bad idea to get some ownership in this fight. And it's reasonably priced. Volkan Oezdemir, 8,400, and Yuri Prochazka is 7,800. So when this slate was first released and this card was first announced, I really liked Volkan Oezdemir. But as I did more research and watched more of the Ryzen fights by Yuri Prochazka, it's definitely made me more cautious about Volkan. It's difficult to assess because the level of competition in Ryzen, though he has fought some veterans and some guys that grace the UFC octagon, I mean, those fighters were not ever really legit contenders in the UFC. So it makes it difficult. This is going to be a big step up in competition for Yuri Prochazka. So in my ideal lineup, I probably am going to avoid this fight. But for tournaments, this fight just has such a high % chance of ending in a finish that it wouldn't surprise me that whoever wins these big tournaments in DFS this weekend, they're going to have one of these fighters, right? And like one of these fighters is probably going to get a first round knockout victory. So, I guess my advice might be here would be to diversify our lineups and maybe get some exposure to both guys. Because of their price points, you should be able to fit them, both in interchangeably and keep the rest of your lineup pretty consistent. So. All right, let's move on to the next fight here. Now we're headed to the main card. PVZ, Paige Van Zandt versus Amanda Ribas. And it's interesting to me that this is on the main card. I guess it's not that interesting. Paige Van Zandt is going to, I suppose, bring in viewers because of her time with Dancing on the Stars. I mean, I hate to hate on any of these professional MMA fighters, but let's call a spade a spade. Paige Van Zandt is not a great UFC fighter. Is she UFC quality? I suppose. But I don't see her ever challenging for a title in the near future. And I like what the UFC did here because Paige Van Zandt was out on Twitter and is talking about how she made more money on Dancing with the Stars than she's made in her entire UFC career. And this is actually her last fight on her contract. So what the UFC decided to do is basically feed her to a hungry hyena in Amanda Ribas here. And they're making Paige prove her worth. And that's why she's a massive underdog. Biggest underdog on the card at plus 525. And Amanda Ribas is a huge favorite at minus 850. So Paige Van Zandt, 8-4. Amanda Ribas, 9-1 in her professional MMA record. Let's just take a look at some of their most recent fights. Dating Paige Van Zandt. Now, Paige Van Zandt is a UFC veteran at this point, so she's fought some tough competition. She was choked out by Rose Namajunas. She does have a victory over Beck Rawlings, pretty impressive. She was subbed by Michelle Waterson. She lost by decision to Jessica Rose Clark, and then in her most recent fight, which is about a year and a half ago, she did sub Rachel Ostovich, which was pretty impressive. I'm not gonna lie. So I don't know, maybe Paige Van Zandt's on the up here, but fighting against Amanda Ribas, who is been in the UFC now for a little while, about a year, maybe a little bit more than that. She's had 3 UFC fights, undefeated in the UFC. She subbed Emily Whitmire. She beat Mackenzie Dern, unanimous decision. That was super impressive. A lot of people thought Dern would beat her there. And then her most recent fight, she beat Randa Marcos by decision. So, size, these girls stack up very evenly. Both 5'4", 65, 66-inch reach. Paige Van Zandt has been fighting out of Team Alpha Male. So shout out to Team Alpha Male. Let's look at the advanced analytics. So I think this is where you're going to see some significant differences here. Striking is going to be pretty even. In fact, I'm just pulling it up now. Paige Van Zandt, about 3.5 significant strikes landed per minute. Amanda Rebus, 4.85. Strike absorbed, though, is where you're going to see a little bit of a difference. Rebus, 1.7. Paige Van Zandt, 2.63 per minute. And Amanda Rebus's defense on the feet is high quality. Dern's a heavy hitter. She was able to stand in there, last the entire fight, get the decision victory. In the grappling department, again, this is where Rebus is going to have a big advantage. Attempts about 1 more takedown per 15 minutes. Her takedown defense is 85%, and submissions per 15 minutes, 1.6 to Paige Van Zandt's 1. But this is the big number that stands out. Paige Van Zandt, 35% takedown defense. That is not good. That spells bad news fighting Amanda Rebus. And that's exactly what I expect to happen in this fight. I expect Amanda Rebus to take her down at will whenever she wants to. And I think she's got a good chance to get a submission. So from a DFS perspective, Amanda Rebus will be in my lineup. Even though she is the priciest fighter here, $9,500 is her salary. I just think she has the best chance for a win and the smallest chance to be upset here. And not only will she win, I think she's got a decent chance to get a finish. I think she has a really good chance to sub Paige Van Zandt. So I'm going to have a lot of exposure to Amanda Rebus and absolutely none of Paige Van Zandt. And I would recommend you following suit. If you're not going to hop on the Amanda Rebus train, that's cool. But I just don't see Paige Van Zandt standing a chance in this fight. All right, so we're going to move up to the next fight on the card, which happens to be another female fight in the strawweight division. Jessica Andrade versus Rose Namajunas, and this is a rematch, of course. They previously fought a couple years ago. What has it been, 2 years? No, I'm crazy. It was just a year ago. Time flies. Anyway, Jessica Andrade won that fight via KO, which some people would consider a fluke victory because she slammed her on the back of her head. Rose was taking her back. Let's just go through the numbers real quick. Andrade, 20-7, UFC veteran. Rose Namajunas, 8-4, again, UFC veteran and former belt holder. I guess actually Andrade was too, both of them were. So betting odds, though, this is interesting in this one. Despite Andrade winning the first time they met, she is the underdog here at plus 170, and Namajunas is minus 210. Namajunas does have a size advantage. She's 5'5", 65-inch reach. Andrade, 5'2", 62-inch reach. But she doesn't have a strength advantage. Jessica Andrade is a tank, and that showed in the first fight when she slammed her on the back of her head and TKO'd her. And I don't see that changing. Andrade is just built different. Let's be honest. She's just jacked for a female that weighs 115 pounds. And Andrade, when she came to the UFC, she was fighting at 125 as a 5'2" fighter and had decent success there. And she's been very successful as a strawweight. So this is going to be a great fight. This is something I'm looking forward to. Rematch here. Now, Rose Namajunas has not fought since she lost to Andrade. But Andrade did fight Weili Zhang and lost that fight She was TKO'd. She was just outclassed, just from a striking perspective. Let's just call it how it is. She was outclassed by Weili, and Weili really impressed me in that fight because she was able to eat Andrade's shots, and when she lands, she hits hard for a 115-pounder. Let's get into the analytics of this fight. All right, so Andrade, 6.5 significant strikes landed per minute. Rose Namajunas, about 4. Andrade, 51% strike accuracy. That's good. Strikes absorbed, 5.28. That number is probably inflated a little bit based on that Weili fight. And Rose Namajunas, 3.88. So both fighters are pretty average from a defensive perspective. And then grappling. This is where people really think that Rose has the edge, which is probably why she's the favorite. Takedowns per 15 minutes, though, Andrade averages more. 3.2 to Rose's 2.17. Takedown defense, Andrade, 76% to Rose Namajunas, 46%. So this is where I'm a little bit confused. Because if you look at the numbers, Andrade is just, statistically speaking, a better fighter. From a striking perspective, from a power perspective, from a grappling perspective. Now, Namajunas does have legitimate jiu-jitsu skills. She averages about a sub every 15 minutes. But Andrade isn't a slouch there either. She's a trained Brazilian fighter. They trust me, they have experience in that department. So she averages 0.5 subs per 15 minutes as well. So I don't agree with Vegas on this one at all. And maybe I'm crazy to think that way. Maybe it just seems too obvious to bet on Andrade for this fight. But I love the plus 170 odds straight up. And then from a DFS perspective, I just think Andrade 7,200 is just too good to pass over. Because she has the ability to finish any 115-pounder, and she's shown that she already had finished Rose Namajunas previously. So Andrade, and she's a high output fighter too. So if this goes the distance, even if she loses like a split decision, she might not kill your card. In tournament at that price line, she doesn't have to put up 100 points in order for her to provide value with what you're paying with the $7,200 salary. So I really like Andrade. I expect her to be reasonably high owned. On the other side here, Rose Namajunas, $9,000 salary. That is just crazy to me. It's not a 5-round fight, and you have 3 5-round fights on this card. So I would argue that any fighter in those 3 championship bouts is more valuable than Rose Namajunas. And some of them can be had for cheaper that are favorites, such as Kamaru Usman. So I don't see a scenario where I'd have Rose Namajunas in any of my lineups. I'd much rather save $100 and roll out Kamaru Usman. Or pay $100 more for Volkanovski. All right, so now we're going to move on to the title fights. Starting off with the vacant UFC bantamweight division championship belt, thanks to Henry Cejudo retiring. It's Petr Yan versus Jose Aldo. And this is an interesting fight for so many reasons. I guess the most significant reason why it's interesting is because Jose Aldo is technically coming off of a 2-fight losing streak. And I say technically because the last fight against Marlon Moraes, which also happened to be his first bantamweight fight at 135 pounds, was a razor-thin, close decision, and Marlon Moraes was given the split decision nod. I watched that fight. I didn't agree with it. Moraes may have had more output, but Aldo took way less damage, and when he landed, I feel like his strikes were more significant. So, and Dana White obviously agreed. He talked about it in the post-fight press conference, and I assume that's one of the factors that came into play when they decided to give Aldo a title shot here. And the other reason, just because he's Jose Aldo. He's just been a legend in the sport, He always shows up. So, Aldo coming in at 28-6, but guy's a UFC Hall of Famer, and he's still relatively young. He's been around forever, but he's only 33 years old, which is hard to believe. Fighting the young gun, up-and-comer, Peter Yan, 27 years old, 14-1 record, has been dominant in the UFC thus far. KO'd Douglas Andrade, won a unanimous decision versus John Dodson, won a unanimous decision versus Jimmy Rivera, and then KO'd Uriah Faber. So he's fought legit UFC competition. He's looked very impressive. Even in those decision victories, it's not like any of them were really close fights. Maybe you could argue the Jimmy Rivera one was. He did land a couple big shots, but Peter Yan put it on him. Peter Yan this guy's an animal. I'm a big believer in this kid, man. His striking, his boxing is so technical. It's so clean. He can take you down if he wants to. He's solid on the ground. You'll see submission attempts. He's no problem getting back up. He's just a strong fighter for a fighter of that stature, 5'7", 67 inch reach. He's just built solid, man. I really like him here in this spot versus Jose Aldo. I'm going to break down some of the advanced analytics here. So, significant strikes landed per minute. Peter Yan has an edge at 5.65 to Jose Aldo's 3.47. And Peter Yan, I mean, striking accuracy solid too, 46%. Does absorb 3.15 strikes per minute. Jose Aldo absorbs 3.18, and they both have solid striking defense. The grappling side of things, this is where Peter Yan's going to have an advantage at close to 2 takedowns attempted per 15 minutes to 0.64 for Jose Aldo. Takedown defense, though, Jose Aldo's always been a difficult opponent to take down. Peter Yan's no different. I expect this fight to be standing for the entire fight. If it goes 25 minutes, which it very well could, I'd expect it to be a back and forth striking fest the entire time. And for that reason, I expect Jose Aldo to be super high owned in DFS. He's the second cheapest fighter at 6,900. And if you're of the belief that, hey, even if you don't think he's going to win, but he can survive and go 5 rounds with Peter Yan, he's going to provide value, right? He's going to output some strikes, and I could see him putting up 80, 90 points if this goes 25 minutes, even if he loses. So if you're looking for that fight of the year, another fight of the year candidate, this could be it. This could be really back and forth. I like Peter Yan here, but at 9,300, you have to really pick your spot. So yeah, one of the interesting strategies that I actually like this weekend here is stacking a couple of these title fights. And the Peter Yan, Jose Aldo one definitely is something that you can look at, because if you believe that this is truly going to go the distance of full 5 rounds, and the style that these two guys and the pace they like to push, though Aldo has slowed down a little bit in his older years here, there's definitely going to be a lot of points to go around. I mean, 2 weeks ago, if you had Hooker and Poirier, you were in a good spot, right? Dan Hooker lost the fight by decision, still put up over 80 points on DraftKings, which was solid for his price point. So I feel as though Aldo is going to be high owned. You're probably going to see some people that stack, and this would be one of the fights that you could do that in. I don't think I'm going to have much Yan exposure, like I was kind of getting at earlier there. There's some other people I like at that price point, such as Rebus, and even Volkanovski, which we're going to talk about. And also, I think I'm going to stay away from Aldo just because I think he's going to be so high owned, and I am really high up on Yan, so I could see Yan getting the finish. So for that reason, I'm going to stay away from Aldo. But if I were to play Aldo, I would probably stack him with Peter Yan. All right, so moving on to the next fight here, co-main event, Alexander Volkanovski in a rematch versus Max Holloway for the UFC Featherweight Championship, another 5-round fight here. And man, what an interesting first fight when Volkanovski fought Max Holloway. And the reason why I say it was interesting is because Volkanovski looked so strong in those beginning first 3 rounds. And then Max really did begin to pick it up towards the end of the fight, really started to push the pace. And I mean, the way I judged it was 3-2 Volkanovski. So I guess I was content or happy with the judges' scores. Really wasn't content with the outcome because I am a Max fan. But yeah, let's take a look at the co-main event here of Volkanovski versus Holloway. Volkanovski 21-1 versus Max Holloway 21-5. Volkanovski's been on a tear ever since he made it to the UFC. This guy's done nothing but win. As I mentioned, he had already beat Max Holloway unanimous decision about 6 months ago. Before that, he beat Jose Aldo. Before that, knocked out Chad Mendes. Beat Darren Elkins unanimous decision. I mean, the guy's just been on a complete tear. Max Holloway, of course, lost to Volkanovski. Before that, he did beat Frankie Edgar. He took an L to Dustin Poirier, which, I mean, Poirier is a crafty veteran and a complete stud in his own right. And Max Holloway jumped up a weight division to take that fight. He ended up going 5 rounds, so props to Holloway for that fight. You can't take much away from him there. And then before Poirier, of course, that beautiful performance against Brian Ortega where he just was relentless with his volume and ended up getting a TKO finish. And he also has the back-to-back wins over Aldo. So betting odds in this one, Volkanovski minus 235, Holloway plus 185. I'm surprised Vegas doesn't have this a little bit closer. I really am. Just because the first fight was close, and it wasn't like Volkanovski ever put Max in harm. I think one of the things that Volkanovski did really well in that first fight was that low calf kick. Max with that boxing style, he has some weight on that front leg. That lead leg, and Volkanovski really took that away from him, damaged that calf, and made Max just always think in the back of his mind about that low calf kick, and also had to switch stance, which isn't a huge deal for Max. He can fight orthodox, unorthodox. He's good in both stances. So I was surprised Volkanovski was as successful as he was the first time around. Very big height advantage on Max Holloway's side. He's about 5 inches taller, 5'11". Volkanovski's 5'6", but the reach is comparable. Volkanovski has long arms, so actually has a longer reach at 71 inches to Max's 69 inches. Let's break down some of the stats here, because I think we'll find these a little bit interesting, just taking these stats into account based on what happened in the first matchup, because stats are going to be pretty close. Max Holloway definitely has more output from a striking point of view, averaging 6.6 significant strikes per minute to Volkanovski's 6.15. Striking accuracy, though, that's where you see a little bit of a difference. Volkanovski 57% accuracy to 44% for Max Holloway. Strikes absorbed, Volkanovski 3.14 per minute to Holloway's 4.45. So again, it's not a huge difference there. They're pretty even. Their defensive numbers are pretty close. Volkanovski does have a big advantage when it comes to grappling, averaging 2.16 takedowns per 15 minutes. Holloway, as we know, is a stand-up fighter. Not a guy that's going to force takedown attempts. So, but Max has great takedown defense. He's long and rangy for that division. 85% takedown defense. Volkanovski 72% takedown defense. But I think that's all irrelevant. It didn't really come into play in the first fight. I don't suspect that it will in this fight either, just because Max is so good at preventing the takedown, and Volkanovski had success striking, so I don't know if he'll go away from that. If I were to bet this fight, I just think those odds are not painting an accurate picture of the first fight. I just don't think Volkanovski dominated. You can get Max Holloway plus 185. I think there's great value there. But it's something that I would probably parlay, because I just think Volkanovski was still successful enough. And unless Max makes some changes and starts checking some kicks and really just throwing more. The amount of volume that Holloway typically throws was not there in the last fight against Volkanovski, because he's such a good defensive fighter. So I guess I would lean Volkanovski. I think Volkanovski will probably win, but I just wouldn't be comfortable putting money on Volkanovski if he's minus 235. I'd rather throw Max and do a Hail Mary type parlay. From a DFS perspective, it's really similar to what we talked about in the last fight with Jose Aldo and Peter Yan. The price points are similar too. So Max Holloway 7,100. Alexander Volkanovski is 9,100. So this is a scenario where I really do like stacking this fight, and I feel and just like I mentioned in the last fight, I think because of the title fights, you can get pretty strategic and crazy with how you're setting up your lineups here in DFS. And for me, it was just really weighing out which fight I think is going to have more of an output, because I think they're both just as likely to go to the 5 rounds, go the distance. So to me, I think Volkanovski and Max Holloway will probably see more output in that fight than we will with Peter Yan and Jose Aldo. I just think Jose Aldo, 33 years old, getting up there in age, and he's fought more defensive over his past couple fights. Whereas if Max Holloway brings his typical Max Holloway, we're going to see a lot of output there. And if he's putting a lot of output, in order for Alexander Volkanovski to win, he has to match that output as well, or at least hit him with big shots and do some damage. So I like stacking those two, but I don't think you can go wrong with Max Holloway this weekend. 7,100 for someone that averages 90 fantasy points in DraftKings is just too good a value to pass up. So I think he'll be pretty high owned as well. Let's go ahead and move on to the main event, which of course is Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. Been waiting for this fight. Man, it just sucks because I'm a Masvidal fan, but don't have a lot of confidence in him here. I will say that, especially because it's short notice. And if Kamaru Usman fights to the level that he fought his last fight against Colby Covington, I think Jorge Masvidal is going to have a real tough time handling him. Let's go over just the basic information here. Kamaru Usman, 16-1. And undefeated in the UFC with wins over the likes of Colby Covington, Tyron Woodley, Rafael dos Anjos, Damian Maia, you name it. Versus Jorge Masvidal, a seasoned, grizzled veteran with a record of 35-13. And I saw a fun fact on him. His 48 fights are the most professional fights in the history of MMA before having a title shot, which is crazy, and shout out to Jorge Masvidal because he's definitely earned it. Betting odds, Kamaru Usman is a pretty stout favorite at minus 280. Jorge Masvidal is plus 220. Height, Kamaru Usman's about an inch taller at 6 foot. Masvidal's 5'11", and of course reach, Usman has an advantage there as well of about 4.5 inches, 77 inches to Masvidal's 73. And, you know, two really great gyms in this fight too. One of the things that I really haven't talked enough about in this breakdown, but you have Hard Knocks 365, Henry Hooft, and you have Masvidal coming from American Top Team. So, I mean, these guys are coached up. We're going to dive into the advanced analytics here and take a peek at some things. Significant strikes landed per minute. Usman 4.6, Masvidal 4.33. That actually surprises me a little bit. You know, Masvidal is known for being such a game fighter. He's a guy that wants to strike and mix it up. I was expecting that number to be a little bit higher, but he's had a lot of UFC fights, man. So striking accuracy is pretty close. Usman 52%, Jorge Masvidal 47%. Strikes absorbed close as well. Usman 2.17 to Masvidal's 2.94. And then grappling's where you're going to see a difference. Usman is just such a beast. D1 wrestler, 3.44 takedown attempts per 15 minute. Masvidal 1.7 takedown accuracy, 50% for Usman, 59% for Masvidal, and Masvidal's no slouch when it comes to wrestling either. He's got that wrestling background as well. Used to train with Colby Covington. You know, those guys were training partners, and you know, they were always mixing it up back when they were cool. But what's amazing about Usman is that 100% takedown defense. He's never been taken down, and that was evident in the Colby Covington fight, right? Because Colby, despite the fact that he took some damage, no point did he really attempt to ever take Usman down. Their wrestling pedigrees and background really neutralized each other. So, and I see the same thing happening in this fight with Masvidal. So, and Masvidal has good takedown defense, about 78%. But Masvidal's not really big for that division, that welterweight 170-pound division. You know, Masvidal's fought at 155 as well. I think Usman could probably take down Jorge Masvidal at will. His technique is just, it's so good. His upper body strength, I mean, his back is massive. He's shredded, man. And I just don't see an area in this fight where Jorge Masvidal has an advantage. And the fact that he's coming in on 6 days' notice, didn't have like a legitimate training camp. I mean, I really think the odds are stacked against him. And the minus 280 odds for Kamaru Usman doesn't scare me. I think it's it's not a risk-free bet because Masvidal does have that it factor, right? Like what he did against Ben Askren. You know, he has the ability to just pull a win out, man. And he can finish you. He has legitimate power. Can knock you out, the flying knee. He is game, man. He's going to go in there to scrap. So it's not a risk-free bet. I just don't see a scenario that Masvidal wins this fight unless something freaky, Hail Mary-ish were to occur. And I just think Usman's too sound technically to allow that and too prepared to allow that to happen. So I really like Usman in this fight. And I also like Usman from a DFS perspective. At 8,900, that's great value. He averages 113 fantasy points per fight, which is just fantastic. And you're just getting great value if you have Usman in your lineup right now. One of the reasons why that salary was low, because this fight was, of course, initially scheduled to be against Gilbert Burns, who would have been an underdog against Usman as well, but not as big as an underdog as Jorge Masvidal. I think Burns presented some additional challenges for Usman that Masvidal might not, and that's because Burns is just so slick in his jiu-jitsu, very well-rounded fighter, and they train together at the same gym, so you really don't know. That always has an impact on a fight. If you know guys have sparred against each other, they should be able to get a good read and pick up on tells, and that can often lead to some weird outcomes in fights. So really like Kamaru Usman. So what I'm going to do at this point now is hit you with my ideal DFS lineup, and we're trying to go 4 for 5. 3 of the past 4 weeks I have cashed in tournaments, and the main tournaments that I've entered haven't won any huge money at this point, but consistently cashing, which is good. So my ideal optimal lineup for DraftKings this week would be Amanda Ribas at a 9,500 salary, Alexander Volkanovski at 9,100, Kamaru Usman at 8,900, Muslim Salikov 8,200, Jessica Andrade, she's at 7,200, Max Holloway 7,100. So as you can see, I have a stack in play there, which sometimes difficult for tournaments because it ensures that you're taking an L. You're not going to get any bonus points for a win from one of your fighters. But as I mentioned before, at that 7,100 price point, Max Holloway should be able to provide some value there. And on output alone, hit the target mark, which is exactly what we want. So yeah, main lineup: Ribas, Volkanovski, Usman, Salikov, Andrade, Max Holloway. Lock it in. And stay tuned for the next DFS UFC breakdown that I will be providing you guys on a weekly basis as long as there's a UFC card. Let's get it.